I realized my salary had already become a joke before it was ever questioned, when I heard a woman's voice laughing outside the conference room saying, "You know how much we're paying, Scott," as if it were funny to everyone listening, and I kept walking without turning back because I recognized the voice as Jessica Miller, our new VP of Strategic Operations, a 34-year-old Wharton MBA whose confidence came more from power than experience. "My name is Scott Williams, I'm 48 years old, and I've worked at Pinnacle Financial Group in Dallas for 15 years after spending 8 years in the Army Corps of Engineers, where I learned to tell the difference between something that only looks broken and something that truly is, because in Iraq even a small failure in a perfect-looking system could cost lives, a lesson I still carry with me. My wife Sarah and I have been married for 22 years. Our daughter Emma is starting her senior year at UT Austin studying environmental engineering. Our son Jake has just been accepted into Texas A&M for mechanical engineering, and with college fees, a mortgage in Plano, and car payments, my role as Senior Risk Architecture Director at Pinnacle isn't just a job, it's the foundation protecting everything my family and I have worked so hard to build. My role isn't flashy and it never appears on earnings calls or in company newsletters, but the systems I built are the reason we've cleared every federal audit without escalation for 7 straight years, and the reason major institutional clients, including pension funds managing a combined $47 billion, trust our risk reports completely, even though none of that fits neatly into a PowerPoint slide about cutting costs. From outside the conference room I could hear papers moving and numbers being tossed around, reducing my work to a single figure. My $580,000 compensation package made up of salary and performance bonuses tied to audit results and client retention, with no mention of the regulatory structure keeping us compliant across 12 states or the $18 million in fines we avoided just last quarter, just a number meant to sound excessive. When I joined Pinnacle 15 years ago, it was still run by its founders, 2 former Goldman professionals who started the firm in 1987, where decisions were discussed rather than imposed and systems were built with backups and human judgment layered over automation, and I was hired not for speed but for my understanding of how failures begin quietly and how small, ignored flaws can turn into disasters, a culture that didn't survive the company's sale to Blackstone equity partners for $2.8 billion 3 years ago. New executives started rotating in every 18 months, each one pushing their own efficiency plans, and when Jessica arrived 6 months ago she brought charts, digital transformation roadmaps, and polished buzzwords like lean operations, resource reallocation, AI automation, and legacy system upgrades, terms that sound smart but often hide how little they explain about what actually keeps the firm running. During our monthly risk committee meetings she'd lean forward with rehearsed confidence and casually ask whether long-standing controls were still needed, if compliance monitoring could be handed over to AI, or what the return was on human oversight, and I answered calmly, kept it short, and documented everything. Because once someone starts calling you too expensive, they've already made their decision and are just preparing the paperwork. What Jessica and the new leadership failed to understand was that my salary wasn't just pay. It was insurance against the kind of hidden failure that could destroy a firm overnight. And my role wasn't just a title on an org chart, it was a load-bearing support holding up a structure most people never notice. 3 weeks before that conversation, I'd had lunch with my old Army friend Mike Henderson, now a compliance officer at a rival firm in Houston, and over his meal he asked if I'd seen what happened to Greystone Capital, where new leadership decided their chief risk officer was unnecessary, and 6 weeks later the SEC uncovered a gap in municipal bond reporting that led to a $340 million fine and the loss of their 3 largest pension clients. I told him I'd read about it and mentioned the CRO had warned them during his exit interview, and Mike shook his head and said these MBA types think risk management is just software you can buy, not institutional knowledge, trusted relationships, or knowing which regulator to call when something feels off, and I agreed that experience is the real difference, even though it never shows up in a cost-benefit analysis. That conversation stayed with me as Jessica's questions grew sharper and more frequent, and in our last one-on-one meeting she opened a spreadsheet and said my pay made up 31% of the entire risk management budget and asked me to explain the value. So I responded by showing her our audit outcomes, client satisfaction data, and compliance performance metrics. I could tell by the look in her eyes that she wasn't listening anymore, she was calculating, and when a meeting invite arrived on a Tuesday morning in October titled Strategic Alignment Review with the full leadership team listed, I knew exactly what it meant because I'd seen this kind of setup before in the military, where meetings like this aren't about alignment but about making a one-sided decision look shared. The night before, I sat in my home office in Plano updating my resume for the first time in 15 years, noticing Emma's car in the driveway as she came home from Austin for the weekend and hearing Sarah in the kitchen, likely grading her middle school math papers, and I reread my employment contract, focusing on the continuity assurance clause added during the private equity takeover when the new owners realized how much knowledge sat in key roles, and for the first time in weeks I smiled. Because sometimes the best preparation is simply understanding what you're about to face, and the next morning I took my usual seat in the executive conference room, the same chair I'd sat in for years. I took my usual seat facing the same large Samsung screen, aware that much of the confidence in this room depended on systems few people could still explain, as the space quickly filled with Daniel Garcia, our uneasy-looking COO, Sarah Johnson, our general counsel, reviewing files on her iPad, and 3 Blackstone board observers, including the sharp woman known for tough questions, while Jessica stood at the front polished and prepared in her press blazer and serious look, smiling like someone who believed the outcome was already decided. She opened the meeting with practiced confidence, thanking everyone and stressing the need to review resource allocation as Q4 approached, then clicked to a slide titled Operational Excellence through Strategic Right-Sizing, which sounded impressive but meant little, and followed it with talk about legacy structures no longer fitting our growth plans before revealing a pie chart that reduced everything to numbers, pointing out that risk management made up 23% of our operating costs and sat well above industry benchmarks.
I felt the mood in the room change as people realized what was coming, and Jessica's voice softened into that careful executive tone as she said this wasn't about individual performance and called me a valued contributor in the past tense, which said everything, before clicking to slides about how modern risk management had evolved, claiming compliance platforms now work with near-perfect accuracy and AI can spot problems faster than people, framing it as a question of optimizing human capital. I noticed Daniel shift uncomfortably and Sarah stop writing as another slide appeared showing projected savings of $650,000 from eliminating risk architecture oversight, with no name attached but everyone knowing who it meant, as the room quietly leaned away from me with eyes avoided and pens nervously clicked, until a Blackstone observer asked about the transition timeline and Jessica confidently answered with a chart outlining a 90-day knowledge transfer and a full move to automated systems by the end of the year. As she talked about capturing institutional knowledge through a so-called knowledge transfer, a phrase that always sounded like trying to copy a human mind onto a flash drive, Sarah Johnson asked whether legal had reviewed the contract implications, and Jessica confidently replied that HR had confirmed standard restructuring provisions applied, calling it a business decision, which nearly made me smile because she clearly hadn't read Section 12.3 of my contract added after the private equity deal when Blackstone flagged concentration risk. When she asked for final questions, I could have stayed quiet, but my military years taught me that the unexpected move can be the strongest, so I stood up, placed a sealed envelope in front of Daniel Garcia, and calmly said I wanted to save everyone time, freezing the room and briefly cracking Jessica's confidence, and as she tried to dismiss it as unnecessary drama, I set my security badge on top of the envelope, the sharp sound echoing in the sudden silence. I told them the envelope contained my immediate resignation and a copy of Section 12.3 of my contract that legal should review, and as Sarah Johnson opened it and read, I watched her expression shift from routine focus to concern, her eyes widening slightly as Daniel asked what it said, and she explained it was a continuity assurance clause requiring board approval and a 180-day transition for any restructuring, otherwise triggering full acceleration of my deferred compensation. The room went silent as Richard from Blackstone asked what that meant, and Sarah read on, listing 5 years of performance bonuses, equity adjustments tied to firm valuation, and penalty clauses linked to client retention, while Jessica's face drained of color and Sarah calmly added that HR never reviews executive continuity provisions because those are handled directly by legal during acquisitions. I pushed my chair back and stood up, thanked everyone for the opportunity, and wished them stability in the weeks ahead before taking one last look around the room. As I headed for the door, I heard Daniel Garcia urgently ask Sarah about their exposure, but I didn't stop to listen, and when the door closed behind me, I knew they were about to learn what too expensive truly meant. By the time I reached the parking garage, My phone was already vibrating with missed calls from familiar numbers that I chose to ignore, because there's a brief moment after a decision like that where denial is gone but consequences haven't hit yet. Sitting in my F-150, I stared at the Pinnacle building where I had spent 15 years of my life, 43 floors filled with 2,400 people who had no idea what was coming. I called Sarah on my personal phone, and when she warmly asked how the meeting went, I told her I had resigned. After a pause, she asked if I was okay, and I told her I was more than fine and would explain everything at home, then asked her to pick up Emma and Jake this weekend because I wanted us all together. When she said I was scaring her and asked what was happening, I reassured her that nothing bad was going on, just that things at Pinnacle were about to change, and I wanted the kids to hear it from us first. After I hung up, I drove home to Plano in complete silence, no radio or podcasts, just the calm anticipation of seeing a carefully built system work exactly as planned. I could picture what was happening in that conference room without being there, because legal teams don't panic loudly, they panic step by step, with Sarah Johnson pulling contracts, calling outside counsel, and running numbers that kept getting worse. That afternoon, an automated email hit my personal inbox saying my role-based access had shifted to unsupported status, not because I changed anything, but because the system was built to protect itself when ownership became unclear. The compliance dashboards didn't go offline, they froze, which is worse, because outages suggest maintenance while frozen systems suggest failure. By 4:30 p.m., my former colleague Ashley Turner texted from her personal phone saying there was an emergency legal meeting and asking what I had done, and I replied that she should read my contract, section 12.3. By evening, the first client question arrived, not to me but to Pinnacle's compliance inbox, from the Teachers' Retirement System of Texas, which manages $28 billion, asking who was now certifying their quarterly risk disclosures, and there was no answer because no one else had the required regulatory certifications, something my replacement would need at least 18 months to obtain. Soon after, another message came from the Harris County Employees Retirement System asking whether model continuity provisions were still being met under the new structure, provisions buried in an 847-page agreement that specifically named my role. It wasn't my name listed in those contracts but the role I held and the certifications tied to it. At 9:15 p.m., my attorney Patricia Martinez called and said she had reviewed the situation and that Section 12.3 was as solid as she warned when we negotiated it 3 years earlier, though seeing it actually play out felt different. She asked if I was sure I wanted full enforcement and explained that, if triggered the next day at current valuation, it meant roughly $47 million in accelerated compensation before secondary effects. Those secondary effects were client contract clauses, since several major institutional clients had termination rights if key personnel left without a proper transition, pushing potential exposure into the hundreds of millions if it snowballed. Inside Pinnacle, Jessica was probably arguing that I had simply resigned and nothing had truly changed, hoping the language could be stretched, but contracts don't bend. They execute when conditions are met, and these triggers were clear. The clause wasn't meant to punish anyone. It was designed to protect the firm and its clients after Blackstone's acquisition exposed how much critical knowledge was concentrated in a few roles, activating safeguards when those roles ended without proper handover. By midnight, finance had run the first scenario, and by Thursday morning, they were running it again. Each time they reran the numbers, the risk grew as more contract connections surfaced, and what no one had anticipated was the network effect, because my role wasn't isolated but woven into continuity assurances across many client agreements. Those agreements included cross-default language, so a problem in one area created leverage in another and then another, amplifying the impact. The Texas Teachers' Retirement System, for instance, had a clause allowing them to pull assets if their designated risk oversight contact was removed without 180 days notice and board approval, putting $4.2 billion at stake, while Harris County had similar language tied to changes in senior risk personnel, exposing another $2.8 billion. Systems built to withstand real stress become brutally rigid when stress is introduced on purpose. On Thursday afternoon, Daniel Garcia called me from his personal phone and said the situation had gone far beyond their original projections, with legal now warning that exposure could reach 9 figures if clients acted. When he asked if there was any way to undo it through some kind of transition that met the contract terms, I was sitting in my backyard watching Emma throw a tennis ball for our golden retriever, Max, enjoying a perfectly normal suburban afternoon while downtown Dallas was likely in chaos, and I told him calmly that the contract was very specific. Once it was triggered, the process could only move forward through execution or escalation, with no option to pause. Resolution meant full enforcement of every acceleration clause, added penalties, and whatever client losses followed, and Patricia could send over the numbers, while escalation meant litigation that would freeze client accounts, activate more default clauses, and likely draw SEC attention because public pension assets were involved. When Daniel, sounding exhausted, asked how they had missed something this big, I gave him the answer I'd been waiting to say, that they hadn't missed it, they had ignored it, and those are not the same thing. After the call ended, Emma came over from the yard and asked who kept calling and whether I was stressed, and I told her it was just work and nothing she needed to worry about. When she quietly asked if we were going to be okay financially, clearly thinking about tuition and what sudden unemployment usually means, I looked at her and said we would be more than okay, and that this might actually turn out to be the best thing that had happened to our family in years. She looked confused but nodded and said she trusted me. By Friday morning, the exposure had settled at $1.3 billion, no longer theoretical but a real overnight revaluation of Pinnacle's enterprise worth. The board held an emergency meeting that evening, and although I wasn't there, I could easily imagine it, with closed blinds, untouched catered food, and the slow weight of realization filling the room. Richard from Blackstone would have asked how they missed this, and the answer was simple. They never asked what my role actually protected, only what it cost. Jessica reportedly argued until her voice gave out, claiming the clause was excessive, unintentional, and impossible to foresee at this scale, but Sarah Johnson didn't push back because she didn't need to, since contracts don't care about intent, only execution. Late Saturday night, the call finally came from Lucas Rodriguez, the board's lead independent director, a man rarely seen publicly but responsible for decisions involving billions, and he opened by thanking me for taking his call. His voice was calm and controlled, the kind that comes from handling crises before and knowing that panic only adds cost. He said the board had been briefed and acknowledged there were communication failures in how the restructuring was handled, which was corporate language for admitting they messed up. He added that they wanted to resolve this quickly in a way that honored my contributions and minimized disruption for clients, and I replied that my attorney had already outlined the terms needed for resolution. After a pause filled with the sound of papers moving, he said they had reviewed the terms and asked the board's single question, whether executing the full settlement would stop the cascade. I appreciated the directness and told him yes, that if it was completed within the contractual window, all client continuity requirements would be met. What followed was a rapid 72 hours, with funds shifted from Blackstone's reserves, credit lines adjusted, and internal memos rewritten repeatedly until they said almost nothing. Jessica's name quietly disappeared from most email lists as she was moved, not fired, into a strategic planning role without real authority, sidelined to avoid further legal risk. When everything was finally signed Tuesday morning, Patricia texted me. When Patricia texted that the agreement had been executed in full and the cascade was contained, I was sitting in my kitchen drinking coffee and flipping through the sports section while the house sat quietly, Sarah already at school, the kids back in Austin and College Station, and Max at my feet. Victories like that aren't loud, there's no celebration, just the calm satisfaction that preparation worked exactly as intended. Within 2 days, quiet messages started appearing on LinkedIn, not from recruiters but from managing partners, CIOs, and board chairs who understood what had happened without needing details, and instead of asking why I left Pinnacle, they asked what I could build next. One conversation stood out with Jordan Martinez, managing partner at Cornerstone Risk Advisors in Manhattan, and during a long Wednesday call from my backyard office, he told me they didn't want me to recreate the past but to design what others weren't anticipating, because regulation was shifting faster than most firms could handle. When I asked about authority, he offered senior partnership, equity, my own team, and full control over my compensation without it being questioned by someone who treated experience like a cost to trim. That was all I needed, and 3 weeks later, Sarah and I flew to New York to sign the contract. Cornerstone's offices filled 4 floors of a midtown tower overlooking Central Park, all clean lines and quiet confidence, the kind of space where major decisions are made without noise. At the signing, Jordan introduced me to their largest client, Calpus, which manages $470 billion, and their CIO, Michelle Garcia, shook my hand and said they'd followed what happened at Pinnacle and were impressed, adding that they valued someone who understood risk management as more than a software purchase. 6 months later, from my new office on the 34th floor, Ashley Turner called to say she'd left Pinnacle 3 months after I did, along with several other senior leaders, and that Pinnacle had just lost the Texas teacher retirement account over concerns about continuity in risk oversight. I wasn't surprised. Because once trust breaks, it spreads quickly. When I asked about Jessica, Ashley said she was now doing compliance consulting at a small firm in Atlanta and had become very careful about reading contracts, which made us both laugh, a reminder that the most lasting lessons are often the costly ones. She was in her final semester, already accepted to graduate school for environmental engineering, and called me one afternoon. "Dad, my friends keep asking about that Dallas Business Journal article, the one about you and Pinnacle. They want to know if you're rich now." I told her we were comfortable, her tuition and Jake's were covered, and her mom didn't have to worry about the mortgage. That's what mattered. Then she asked the real question, "Are you happy? I mean, really happy?" I looked out over the Manhattan skyline, then at the photo on my desk of Sarah, Emma, Jake, and Max in our backyard last Christmas, and said yes, I was exactly where I was meant to be. Nowadays, when I walk into boardrooms, no one asks how much I cost. They ask how much risk I can eliminate, what I see coming that they don't, and they listen when I answer. That matters far more than $1.3 billion ever could, because it was never really about money. It was about being recognized for who you are, respected for what you know, and valued for what you protect. Sometimes you have to walk away from everything you've built to discover your true worth, and if you've prepared well, the system can take care of the rest.